They burned the trial records, mutilated the defendant, and threw his body into a river, but the physical evidence survived. More than 11 centuries later, you can still reconstruct the nightmarish proceeding in which Rome dug up a dead pope, dressed him in sacred robes, and forced his corpse to stand trial. By the end, you'll know why Pope Formosus was pulled from his grave, what was done to his body, and how the men responsible tried to erase the proceeding. But you'll also see what they missed, the fragments that turned a supposedly destroyed scandal into one of history's most disturbing papal crimes. The first thing you need to understand is that this was not a symbolic trial. There was a body in the courtroom. In January of 897, Pope Formosus had been dead for roughly 9 months. His corpse was removed from its tomb, carried back into the Lateran Basilica, and dressed in the vestments of the papal office. The decaying body was then placed on a throne. Across from it sat the reigning pope, Stephen VI. A deacon was assigned to speak for the dead man. Formosus could not hear the accusations. He could not challenge the witnesses. He could not explain why his enemies had waited until death made his defense impossible. And that was the point. Stephen reportedly demanded to know why Formosus had usurped the Roman papacy. The corpse offered only the words placed into its mouth by the terrified clergyman beside it. This sounds like medieval madness, but madness alone doesn't explain the precision. The robes, the tribunal, the formal charges, and the mutilation that followed were all calculated. Someone needed more than revenge. Someone needed the dead pope's entire reign declared legally non-existent. Formosus had not risen quietly through the church. Before becoming pope, he had served as Bishop of Porto and as a skilled papal diplomat. He dealt with kings, missionaries, and rival factions competing for control of Italy. That made him useful, and dangerous. The central accusation against him concerned church law. Bishops were tied to their dioceses, and Formosus had supposedly violated the rules by moving from the bishopric of Porto to the bishopric of Rome. He had also once sworn that he would never return to Rome or seek the papacy. On paper, those charges gave the trial a legal shape. In reality, Rome had become the center of a political war. The fading Carolingian world had fractured into rival claims. Italian nobles competed to control the city. Whoever influenced the pope could influence imperial legitimacy, because a papal coronation could turn an ambitious ruler into a divinely sanctioned emperor. Formosus had first crowned Lambert of Spoleto. Then, fearing the power of Lambert and his mother Agiltrude, he appealed to the Frankish king Arnulf of Carinthia. Arnulf invaded Italy, entered Rome, and received an imperial crown from Formosus. To Lambert's faction, this wasn't diplomacy. It was betrayal. Arnulf appeared to have won. Then his body failed him. During the campaign, he suffered a sudden illness, often described in later accounts as paralysis. His advance collapsed. He withdrew north, leaving Formosus exposed inside a city where yesterday's defeated faction could become tomorrow's government. Formosus died in April 896. His immediate successor survived only about 2 weeks. Then Stephen VI took the papal throne under the shadow of the Spoletan faction Formosus had opposed. Now Stephen faced a problem. Formosus was dead, but his decisions were not. He had appointed bishops. He had ordained priests and deacons. He had crowned rulers. Every sacred act extended beyond his grave through the men who owed their offices to him. If Formosus had been an illegitimate pope, however, those acts could be attacked. His ordinations could be invalidated. His political choices could be stripped of authority. Clergymen elevated by him could lose everything. That gave powerful men an incentive to condemn someone who could no longer resist. So Stephen did something unprecedented in its theatrical cruelty. He turned a corpse into a legal instrument. But before we enter that courtroom, you need to understand something even stranger. The trial's most important target may not have been the dead man sitting on the throne. When Stephen attacked Formosus, he also attacked every living cleric whose authority flowed through him. Imagine that Formosus ordained you as a bishop. If his papacy was void, your ordination might also be void. Every priest you ordained could be challenged. Every sacrament performed under that authority could be pulled into doubt. The consequences spread outward like cracks through glass. Stephen himself had reportedly been made Bishop of Anagni by Formosus before becoming Bishop of Rome. That meant the same rule used against the corpse could threaten Stephen's own position. The prosecution had to bend its logic around the reigning pope while using that logic to destroy his enemies. Here the spectacle becomes more than grotesque. It becomes administrative warfare. A dead body made the accusation visible, but the practical objective was control over offices, loyalties, and legitimacy. The corpse on the throne warned every bishop in the basilica that sacred status could be reversed when political power changed hands. And the audience would have understood the message. Rome was not merely judging its past. It was being taught who now owned the truth. Then Stephen pronounced the verdict, and the performance descended into desecration. Formosus was declared guilty. The papal vestments were stripped from his body. The acts of his pontificate were annulled. Ordinations he had performed were targeted for reversal. Then came the punishment that transformed a legal fiction into physical horror. The 3 fingers used by a pope to give blessings were cut from the corpse's right hand. That detail mattered. The mutilation was aimed directly at the sacred gestures Formosus had performed while alive. His enemies were not simply damaging a body. They were symbolically amputating his spiritual authority. The corpse was dragged through the streets and buried in a grave associated with strangers. But even that was not enough. It was reportedly exhumed again, weighted down, and thrown into the Tiber. Body, office, memory, all were supposed to disappear together. This is where later storytelling adds a haunting turn. The body was said to have washed ashore and been recovered by a monk. Stories circulated that it performed miracles. Whether those claims were devotion, propaganda, or rumor, they reveal something Stephen could not control. The condemned corpse was becoming more powerful as a symbol than it had been as evidence. And Rome was about to turn on the living pope. Within months, Stephen's position collapsed. Public revulsion over the trial likely combined with the same factional violence that had produced it. Ancient accounts also connect the changing mood to the collapse of part of the Lateran Basilica, an event interpreted by some as divine judgment. Stephen was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled in the summer of 897. The judge had followed the defendant into death before the year was over. His successors began reversing the Cadaver Synod. Pope Theodore II, whose reign lasted only weeks, rehabilitated Formosus and had his recovered body solemnly returned to St. Peter's Basilica. Then Pope John IX convened councils at Rome and Ravenna. Formosus was defended. Reordinations were rejected. Trials of dead people were prohibited. Most importantly, the records of the Cadaver Synod were ordered destroyed. There it is, the attempted erasure. The official acts that might have given you a direct transcript of the charges, testimony, and sentence were burned. What survived was not a neat case file. It was a trail of references preserved across hostile writings, defensive treatises, papal decisions, chronicles, and later manuscript copies. The destroyers eliminated the central record. They did not realize how many shadows it had already cast. This is the main reveal: the strongest surviving evidence of the Cadaver Synod is not the corpse, a courtroom transcript, or a single eyewitness account. It is the damage the trial left in other documents. Writers close to the crisis had to argue over whether Formosus's ordinations remained valid. Two clerics associated with his defense, Auxilius of Naples and Eugenius Vulgarius, produced works shaped by the controversy. Their texts survive through later manuscripts, carrying the legal and theological fingerprints of a proceeding whose official acts were meant to vanish. They discussed the forced reordination of clergy, the treatment of Formosus, and the chaos created by attempts to invalidate his acts. They were not neutral reporters. They wrote with positions, loyalties, and objectives. But bias does not make them useless. Bias tells you what was still being fought over. Later chroniclers, including Liutprand of Cremona, preserved vivid descriptions of the corpse dressed in papal clothing, seated for judgment, and stripped after conviction. He wrote decades later, so every dramatic detail must be handled carefully. Yet his account intersects with earlier evidence of the condemnation, its legal consequences, and its reversal. Then there are the councils held after Stephen's fall. Their efforts to restore Formosus and prohibit future trials of the dead make little sense without a scandal serious enough to demand those remedies. You are looking at history through impact marks. The original object is gone, but the crater remains. But here's what they didn't tell you in the sensational versions. Not every familiar detail has equal support. The official trial record is lost. Accounts were written for different political purposes, and some came years or decades after the event. You cannot recover every spoken word. You cannot know precisely how the corpse appeared after months underground. You cannot treat later descriptions like an untouched film reel. Even the name, Cadaver Synod, is a later label. Contemporaries lived through a sequence of accusations, reversals, counsels, and retaliations. They did not experience it as a neatly titled episode in a textbook. This uncertainty doesn't weaken the central story. It sharpens it. A corpse was exhumed. It was dressed and placed before a synod. Formosus was condemned. His body was mutilated and cast away. His acts were attacked. The sentence was reversed, and efforts were made to destroy the proceedings' records. Those points survive because multiple consequences depended on them. History is rarely a perfect confession waiting in an archive. More often, you reconstruct it from the lies people told, the laws they hurried to pass, and the paperwork they were desperate to burn. Zoom out, and the dead pope's trial becomes a symptom of something larger. Late 9th century Rome was trapped in rapid succession, factional coups, imprisonment, and murder. Popes could reign for years, months, or days. Noble families and foreign rulers treated the papal office as both a sacred prize and a political weapon. After Formosus was restored, the conflict still did not end. Later, Pope Sergius III renewed the attack on Formosus and upheld the faction that had condemned him. The dead pope's legitimacy continued to shift as rival groups seized control. That instability exposes the contradiction at the center of the story. The papacy claimed continuity stretching back to St. Peter, yet individual popes could attempt to erase their predecessors, invalidate ordinations, and rewrite the recent past. The Cadaver Synod was meant to settle legitimacy through total humiliation. Instead, it proved that legitimacy could not be secured by spectacle. Stephen controlled the courtroom, the judges, the charges, and the silent defendant. He won every formal decision. And within months, he lost everything. Formosus returned to St. Peter's. Stephen died in prison. The Bern trial survived as one of the most remembered events of the medieval papacy. So what physical evidence couldn't they destroy? Not a preserved body. Not the severed fingers. Not the original transcript. The evidence is the manuscript tradition their actions created, defensive treatises copied by later hands, chronicles preserving the public memory, and council decisions designed to undo the verdict and prevent another dead person from being prosecuted. Each surviving page is one piece of a negative image. You can see what was burned by studying what everyone afterward was forced to explain. Stephen tried to make Formosus disappear by converting his corpse into proof of guilt. But the mutilation, the reburial, the reversal, and the destruction of the records produced a trail far harder to erase than a body. That is the final irony. The dead pope lost his trial, but his enemies lost control of the evidence. More than 1100 years later, you are still examining it. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Because the next story begins with a crowded medieval assembly, a collapsing wooden floor, and a room beneath it filled with human waste. It's called The Erfurt Latrine Disaster Swallowed Medieval Europe's Nobility, and somehow, the reality is even worse than the title.